Alrighty, let's make a start. You might notice on the screen that courtesy of Andrew Daddo, I've decided to change my name by deed poll. It's pronounced the same way, just spelt slightly differently. But my name's Sandy Dunn. I'm Managing Director, Founder of Assetivity. A little bit about me. I'm an industrial engineer by training originally, and most people haven't heard of industrial engineering as a qualification. I describe it as being the engineering degree you do when you don't want to be an engineer. I guess where some mechanical, electrical engineers went on and did more advanced technical stuff, we did units like organisational behaviour, industrial relations, production planning and systems and so forth. So I guess the way I describe it is that a traditional engineering degree, mechanical, electrical, really trains people how to design and build things. An industrial engineering degree, I guess, teaches people how to operate and maintain the assets that other engineers have designed and built. So very strong focus on eliminating waste and efficiency and effectiveness improvement. And I guess my career has kind of followed that path ever since. So started off as a graduate with Alcoa down at the Kwinana, the ill-fated now Kwinana refinery down here south of Perth. Spent some time overseas working for FedEx in Europe. I came back, worked with Jason Industries for a little while, the recliner rockers people. Then joined Pricewaterhouse in their management consulting group and PricewaterhouseCoopers after the merger with Coopers and Lybrand. And 26 years ago, almost to the day, I set up Assetivity as a specialist maintenance, reliability and asset management consulting organisation. And so what we do basically is try and help our clients to improve the performance that they get from their assets, I guess deliver greater value through better asset management, maintenance and reliability improvement. So that's a little bit about us. I guess about me. I guess having been speaking at these events for many, many years, I guess you get interested in some of the research that's being done into professional conferences, and some of that research indicates that on average delegates listen to about 50% of what is presented. They actually hear 50% of what they listen to. They absorb 50% of what they hear. They understand 50% of what they absorb, and they remember 50% of what they understand. So I guess when you add all of that up, what that means out of this 30-minute presentation, you're going to remember about 1 minute. And I hope it wasn't the minute we've just had. But I do hope you get value for money out of the session, right? So this is a case study presentation. Ideally, we would actually have had the client presenting this rather than me presenting it, but for various reasons that hasn't happened. But don't worry, this is not going to be a sales presentation. You don't want to listen to a sales presentation, and I don't want to give a sales presentation. What I am going to talk about, and I guess with the client not being here, it gives a little bit more freedom perhaps to talk reasonably honestly about what we did and what we achieved, but also to talk about some of the issues that we encountered on the job and some of the opportunities for improvement, and I guess where I guess the next level beyond this would potentially go. What we did was reasonably innovative, I think, for the industry, and I guess being innovative in nature was there's some risks involved with that. But I think ultimately we worked well together with the client to come up with some solutions to resolve those risks. And certainly there are opportunities, as I said, to build on what we've started and move that to the next phase. So a little bit of background. This is a mining company, multinational in nature. I won't name the name. But I guess what they were looking to do was to develop a consistent, repeatable approach for assessing asset-related risks and making those more visible to senior decision makers so that risk played a greater part in the decision making associated with the risks, right? So I guess the current issues they had was that there was an inconsistent approach for assessing risk at different of their sites, and they wanted to bring that together into a consistent approach so that I guess you could compare risks across the different sites. They did have an asset criticality assessment process, and we'll just talk in a minute about what's the difference between criticality and risk. Are they actually the same thing, or are they slightly different concepts? But one of the issues with the criticality assessment process that they followed was that it didn't really give them enough of a deep dive into why those assets were rated at the criticality they were, and really what were the underlying asset-related risk that needed to be addressed to, I guess, give some degree of confidence to senior management that those assets were going to continue to operate as they'd intended. So, yeah, as I said, we'll talk about criticality versus risk. Risk is defined, in the relevant risk management standard, ISO 31000, as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And in particular, I guess we typically assess risk along two dimensions, consequence and likelihood. And I guess this is one of the challenges, I guess, when you start thinking about this in the context of risk, versus criticality assessment. Because while there's a well-defined definition for risk and a whole number of different techniques that are available, actually ISO 31010 currently lists 41 different assessments, techniques that you can use for assessing risks, there is no such equivalent international standard for criticality assessment. And so what we often find at the clients we work with is that the approach for assessing criticality varies enormously from organisation to organisation, and in this case, even between sites within the same organisation. And so when you start thinking about equipment criticality, I guess typically it's a fast-track approach. I guess you can only really assess risk in the context of a risk event. So when you're assessing equipment criticality, what is the normally single risk event that you are classifying, you're categorising this asset in terms of risk, right? So you pick one, and you pick the worst one, but there may actually be multiple risks that are associated with that asset. The criticality assessment won't necessarily give you visibility of that. So our approach with this basically was to, first of all, let's use that, and this organisation had, I guess, a defined approach for assessing criticality. It assessed both likelihood and consequences, but the likelihood, but again, what it did was to pick a single risk event and use that to classify the entire asset in terms of criticality. So we're going to use that approach. I mean, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It worked reasonably well. I guess what we wanted to make sure we did was we focused on the most critical assets first, right, before we went down to lower level of detail. And the criticality assessment process gave us the opportunity to do that, to slim down the total number of assets that we're going to do this risk assessment on to those that, at least at face value, seem to be the most critical. And so, what we did was we picked those most critical assets, we selected a subset of that. We then went through a risk and opportunity assessment where we did actually in more detail identify what were the typical risks or the existing risks that were associated with that asset while it was in operation at the moment. We'll talk about the dimensions that we used for doing that in a minute. The then was, having identified those risks and, I guess classifying the individual risk events for each of those critical assets that, were seen as being high risk, then to work with the individual sites that this was done on or done with, I should say, to develop action plans for addressing those risks. In a lot of cases, in reality, the actions that came out were actions that were either already in progress or were already planned, but not necessarily all documented in a single, visible document. So, and in some cases we identified some additional risks that needed to be dealt with as well. And then subsequent to that, was clearly, it's all very well saying, here's what we need to do to address the risks. The final step and the most important step is actually doing those things you said you needed to do, right? Which was, for us, was out of scope for our part of this particular project. It was up to the client really to go ahead and implement those improvement actions. So when we started thinking about the risk assessment approach, I guess, in terms of consequence, that was reasonably straightforward. Again, we used the client's existing asset criticality assessment approach, and typically assessed consequences. And what we were talking about consequences was if this asset completely failed to function, what is the consequence of that? And and we looked at the typical dimensions, safety, environment, production cost, et cetera, in alignment with the client's approach. But then the next level, I guess, was where we differed from their traditional criticality assessment approach, is that when we looked at likelihood, we actually assessed the likelihood of failure along multiple dimensions. And those basically dimensions were, first of all, design. Is the asset actually fit for purpose? Is it currently fit for purpose? Because often what we find in organisations is that when we designed it and when we built it, it was fit for the purpose for which it was originally intended to be used for. But in the meantime, we kept turning the knob up and turning the knob. Now we're trying to run it at 11, right? And it doesn't work very well at 11. So are we aware of that? Right? Or in other situations, it might be that it was designed to the safety standards that existed at the time that the asset was designed and built, but those standards now have changed, right? And there may not necessarily be a mandatory requirement to modify the asset to fit with the new standards, but the fact that it now doesn't meet the current standards, if we were to replace that with a new asset, at the very least we should be aware of that and think about whether we should be doing something to address that risk, right? The second dimension was in operation. So are we actually operating that asset within its intended design operating limits, right? Do we have sound operating practices in place? Do we have operating discipline that makes sure that we're not damaging the equipment by misoperating it or operating it outside its normal design limits? Third dimension was maintenance. So here, is there a suitable preventive maintenance program in place? Does it appear that this preventive maintenance program is being delivered, largely on time and in full? If we don't have a good quality preventive maintenance program that hasn't been designed using, true reliability engineering principles, or if we've got it but we don't actually deliver it, then that's going to represent a risk to the business, right? And then the final area was spare parts. Have we identified what our critical spare parts are? Do we actually have stock of those critical spare parts in the levels that we need them? If we have the stock, are we actually looking after those critical spare parts, or are they sitting out in the yard rusting away, and we hope that we'll never need them, because if we do, we're going to be in huge problems. I remember many years ago being up at Newman, and they had a conveyor gearbox, major conveyor gearbox that was sounding a bit noisy, and so they decided to replace it, and they had a spare that was sitting in the yard in the main warehouse there. So they spent, I guess, the best part of 2 days, removing the old gearbox, putting the new one in, started it up, and then the replacement gearbox was even noisier than the one they'd taken out, because it had never been touched in the 20 years it had been sitting in the yard, right? It was rusted to buggery on the inside, right? So again, these are the types of risks that we're trying to tackle and address here. So as I say, this is just the same thing, I guess, looking in a slightly different way, but we're doing the criticality assessment, we're assessing likelihood in terms of design, operations, maintenance and spare parts, and the final area actually was, which I didn't touch on, was condition. So if we have evidence of the assets being in poor condition, either through condition monitoring results or visual inspections, whatever, then we should recognise that that represents a risk as well. So essentially what we've got is, consequence at the top, and then there's multiple dimensions of likelihood that sit underneath that. In order to do this assessment, we needed a fair bit of data. And I guess it probably comes as no great surprise that in most organisations, and the mining industry is probably certainly no better than any others, the quality and the availability of some of that data was a challenge in terms of this exercise. So again, when we start thinking about the types of data that we needed, from a design perspective, we needed to know what were the original design specifications and how does that compare with what our current operating requirements are, right? Have we done any modifications since that equipment was installed, and does that then impact on the level of risk associated with the design of those assets? From an operation perspective, what are the operating practices? Are they documented? Are they being adhered to? Do we have good operating discipline? Things like set points and alarms, are they actually set at the appropriate levels that make sure that we can't operate outside normal operating envelopes and so forth? And again, from an operational downtime perspective, are we seeing downtime that's been caused by operating practices? From a maintenance perspective, we need to look at our maintenance work order history to find out what sort of failures have been occurring and make a judgment about whether those were potentially preventable through an effective preventive maintenance program. We need to look at that existing preventive maintenance program and do a test of that for reasonableness in terms of does it seem to cover all of the types of failure modes that we would expect it to cover. We looked at the maintenance work instructions to make sure that there was, I guess the guys in the field were being given reasonable guidance about what it is they were supposed to be doing and how they were supposed to be doing it. So they didn't just get a work instruction that said, do the 500-hour service, right? And what's on the 500-hour service is up to you, right? From a spares perspective, we looked at, that's the other way around. From a condition perspective, we looked at the results of recent condition monitoring results and potentially supplemented that with some visual assessments of assets, where that was reasonable to do so on site. And then from a spare parts perspective, had the critical spares been identified? Had there been an attempt to identify those critical spares? Again, were they being held in stock? Was there evidence of proper spare parts care, if you like, and preservation activities happening for those spares while they were in the warehouse? So, a fair bit of data here. Some of this stuff is going to come from corporate systems, so some of that stuff you would expect would be work order history, should be in our corporate information systems. Some of that maybe not so, so things like design information and design specifications, where is that stored? It's not going to be in SAP, it might be somewhere else. I guess for some of the other stuff, however, I guess we couldn't get it out of corporate systems. We really needed to engage and involve the site personnel, to, even if there's no formal documented information, what's their judgment, if you like, what's their experience say is happening here. So, we might not be able to have clear evidence from data that's in corporate systems, for example, that the assets are being operated outside their operating limits, but if we go talking to people, we'll get a sense of whether that kind of operating discipline is or is not in place, for example. So there's some, I guess some information that came from corporate systems. Some of it really needed input from site. Even the stuff that was in corporate information systems really needed to be validated by the guys on site, because as we all know, work orders don't always get recorded against the right functional location and so forth. So all that got loaded into a spreadsheet tool, and there was a whole raft of spreadsheets, I guess, that were done. This is an extract of it for a particular asset in a particular asset class. We had different templates for different asset classes because typically the types of things that we need to consider risk were different, for example, for a hydraulic excavator than it would be for a haul truck, which in turn would be quite different for a primary crusher, et cetera, et cetera. And so this work encompassed both fixed plant and mobile plant. So we had different templates for each equipment class, and basically we went through and we looked at, I guess, what was in place in terms of each of these assessment criteria, if you like, in terms of the level of risk, and we gave them a likelihood rating ranging from 1 to 5 based on what we saw there, right? And that then got combined with the consequence rating for that particular asset class, or that particular asset within that particular asset class, to give an overall risk score. That risk score was based on the client's existing risk matrix, so we just reused that for that purpose. And so, I guess the key outputs out of this exercise were, there's a couple of different areas here. One was that the highlighted risks and the actions, we workshopped those with the site personnel. They identified actions that need to be put in place to address those risks. Accountability was assigned for completing each of those actions and an indicative time frame for doing that. But ultimately, we were working towards getting some sort of visual dashboard that, if you look on the right-hand side here, that says, look, here's the number of assets that we have that we consider high risk, that are in red. Here's the ones that we think are kind of moderate risk in orange. Here's the ones we think are low risk, they're in green. And the ones that are in black, we have no idea because we haven't got enough data to be able to assess those, right? And there will always be some of those, right? So there was a lot of work, as you can imagine. If you think about, I forget how many different assets. There was like well over 1,000 assets we did this for, and when you look at the range of criteria we assessed, I guess there was a hell of a lot of work involved in doing this, and so that created a number of challenges, right? Being totally honest, I think we as consultants, and certainly the client, underestimated the amount of time and effort that was going to be involved in collecting, cleansing, analysing the data and populating those templates. In some cases, the initial versions of the templates that we developed were way too detailed for us to be able to get that done within a reasonable time frame. So I guess if you're thinking about doing something like this yourselves, then I think one of the key messages is don't overcook the egg, don't overboil the egg, right? You start off with something that's reasonably simple and straightforward and build on it, right? And I guess one of the nice things about using spreadsheets is it's pretty easy to build new spreadsheets or add columns and rows in, right? We also had some issues with a particular individual within the client organisation really understanding that risk was the combination of likelihood and consequence, and that when we were doing those ratings of those 5 dimensions I talked about, that was just the likelihood. It wasn't the risk, it was just the likelihood. And we had a few iterations around the houses until we got everyone clear that that's actually what we were trying to do here. Again, just make sure, I don't make assumptions that even necessarily experienced reliability people fully understand and embrace the concept and what it is that you're trying to do here, right? And as I've touched on before, just the data quality and the availability from corporate systems. It took a lot of time to get some of that data out. It took even more time to, I guess, review and assess that. Again, sort of combined with the level of detail made some interesting challenges. And then halfway through the project, global cost reduction program, all of a sudden, no, we haven't got enough money to do this. Can you do it quicker? Can you do it cheaper? Can you reduce scope in some way? So it's the usual way. I guess most big organisations these days, if you got a project that's longer than 6 months, there's going to be some sort of cost reduction initiative halfway through it. So that did throw a little bit of a spanner in the works. But again, we worked through that in conjunction with the client. We were able to, we made it, between us, made a decision to reduce scope, not to cover all of the sites that we were going to cover with this initial project. And some of those sites, the client actually covered them themselves with their own personnel using the tools that we'd built. So some of the solutions, as I say, reduction in scope. Again, one of the ways we reduced the scope was by reducing the number of assets that we analysed. So we, at various points through the project, actually said, no, this long list of assets is still too long. We have to cut that down somehow and just focus on the critical assets. So again, that was a joint decision taken with the client, and I think we got really good collaboration on that. And again, there's a lesson for that. Try again. Don't start with too much detail. We did manage to have standardised assessment templates. It took us, again, a few iterations to get those right, which wasn't something that we'd really expected or budgeted for. But once they were in place, then they worked really, really well. We simplified and reduced the number of assessment criteria. I think I touched on that before. In each of those spreadsheets, we reduced the number of criteria we used. And again, client got more involved, provided more of their resources to help to work on the project, which reduced, I guess our involvement helped reduce the total cost to them. And I just touched on reduce the number of sites to be covered. I guess in terms of benefits, I think, from my perspective, and I think the client would probably agree, that they now have a repeatable process that they can roll out across the remaining sites. We can tweak the process certainly based on the learnings that we've had doing the first 3 or 4 sites I think we did. And it has certainly helped them and the site personnel to identify those high risk assets, but more specifically, what is the nature of those risks and on those high risk assets that need to be addressed. And I guess through the process of working with site personnel in building the improvement plans, the sites have hopefully taken ownership of that. There's certainly some opportunities to do things better if we're going to move that forward. In terms of one of those opportunities, and I guess there's a lot of talk about AI, obviously, today in today's conference. But there's certainly opportunities to have streamlined the assessment process and potentially to use some form of agentic AI to go and query systems and do some of that analysis itself and summarise data in a way that would actually help us to do the risk assessments more quickly. Just in that agentic AI space, that area is moving so quickly. Even in the last 3 months, the advance within Copilot in terms of what agentic AI can do and what's being allowed to do is enormous, right? So there's still going to be further opportunities in that space. Ideally, if we can get this working really well and we can use that agentic AI, to do periodically go and poll systems and so forth, then you could actually update these risk assessments in kind of almost near real time, right? So for example, you might be able to identify that a particular duty standby pair of pumps, the duty pump is actually out of service at the moment because it's being repaired, and so we no longer have a standby that's available to it. So therefore, the consequence rating now gets increased in this model, and that would get flagged up now in this risk assessment that this is now a critical asset that needs to be carefully watched, and you could potentially make that through graphical images and so forth much more visible to the site management team and so forth, right? So there's opportunities to do that. Tell me I'm dreaming. It's probably reality. It's probably 5 or 10 years away before we'll get to that point. But if we have a vision of where we want to end up, then we can start to build something that heads in that direction, right? And we could certainly, even though we made some of those things visible, I'm not sure that, above kind of site mid-management level, I'm not sure that site general managers and certainly corporate general managers really are seeing the output of this just yet. One of the opportunities, I think, to do things a bit differently in this was not so much around the technical stuff, which was a lot of what we've talked about. It's more about the change management piece in terms of actually engaging with the key stakeholders who we see as being the real beneficiaries of this type of work, and getting them to, they had ownership of it in the sense that they funded it, but they didn't really drive it. There's no visible leadership at that kind of senior executive level with it. And so there's an opportunity there then to, I guess, one of my biggest fears with this project, having spent so much time on it and feeling quite proud of it, is that it kind of dies a natural death because senior leaders don't really see that they've got a lot out of it, even though they could, right? So I think there's another opportunity there in that space. Some of the risks, as I say, change management lacking, potentially, with the corporate restructure as well, maybe, changing roles and so forth, the whole project dies a death. I would hate to see that happen, but, it might. And as I said, is there a commitment from senior leadership? Do they see value in the work? But look, hopefully what I've done is sort of give you a bit of an insight into, I guess, the approach we took, some of the challenges that are involved with that. If you're interested in doing something similar within your own organisations, we'd love to have the opportunity to have a chat with you, and so you can learn, and capitalise on our experience in this. Even better, we'd love to work with you to take this, as a joint project to the next level, if that's something that you're interested in. So that's it from me. Any questions? How am I doing for time? I've got loads of time.
Yeah, we've got 5 to 10 more minutes. Question. Do you mind doing it to the mic, please, for the recording?
Oh, hi, Sandy. Just around when you de-scoped because of the project funding.
Yep.
Just interested in how you could categorise what's critical, but also use the client's 5x5 to, if it's quite coarse, then how you could rank what you wanted to.
So it wasn't terribly sophisticated. Essentially when we started off, we had a list of critical assets for each of the sites that was on a 5-point scale, so criticality 1, criticality 2, down to criticality 5. Our original intention was to do all of the criticality 1 and 2 assets. as we got into it, essentially it became obvious that we weren't going to be able to do all those. So the first step was, well, let's look at the criticality to assets, and it was a fairly subjective judgment by people who knew the equipment. Said, well, these are really criticality 2.5, not really a 2, so let's put those to one side. It wasn't a particularly scientific exercise, but we certainly did all the criticality ones, but we cut back on the number of criticality 2 items that we assessed.
Hi, Cindy. Just quick question. So when you do criticality analysis with asset structure and parent-child relationship,
Yep.
sometimes you see the parent asset is not safety critical, but one of the child's is. So what do you do? Is it a blanket approach, or you just separate the number?
Criticality assessment, it's going to... We've only got 10 minutes. The way we do criticality assessment is we start at the top and we work the way down the hierarchy, right? And if you work down your way down the hierarchy and you get to the lowest level of criticality, then by default, everything below that cannot have higher criticality. If there's something that's higher criticality at a lower level in the hierarchy, you haven't done the criticality assessment at the higher level correctly, right? So that's basically the way it's a more streamlined process of doing it, because if you start at the top and work down, once you've got to lowest level of criticality, there should be no need to assess the criticality for anything else underneath, and therefore you save yourselves a whole heap of time, going through and doing criticality assessment on things that at the end of the day don't really matter if they fail. So just something to watch out for, I guess. And that's why it's important that you assess criticality along all of the dimensions, so safety, particularly, you're right, there's some things that might be safety critical at a lower level, not necessarily important for production, but important for safety. You need to make sure you capture that at the higher levels as well.
Hi, Sandy. Thanks for sharing. I'm really curious to understand how much of the data for the risk assessment was actually coming from a data source, and what's your thoughts around it actually becoming digitized? So Woodside did do an ECA in the past, and we also had cost, we ended up doing a little bit of pilot, and then it was a cost situation, and we had to pivot really fast to connect to the consequence likelihood dimensions and actually do a dynamic ECA. So I'm really curious, with the maturity of the data set, could this client get to that stage, and how quickly?
Yeah, in some areas, like maintenance work order data, for example, clearly in corporate systems and accessible. Again, the quality and completeness of some of that depends on the quality with which people actually enter that information into the system. But it's certainly, whatever is there is accessible, and could be downloaded and used as appropriate. Other things that were, I guess, in corporate systems that became a little bit more difficult, we were looking for, looking at downtime data, so I guess for loss accounting system, and trying to account for the downtime and where that was related to operational issues versus maintenance issues. Again, it was kind of accessible, but trying to link specific downtime events to specific maintenance work orders became a challenge because the dates didn't always line up. But again, there was again within the constraints of the quality of the data that was in there, that was available. Where it got, I guess, a little bit more challenging was in the kind of unstructured data area. So things like, what were the design specifications? What were the design parameters? What actually is the design capability of the equipment? A lot of that stuff is kind of buried in manuals, and sometimes when you get the manual, it's the generic manual for the family of equipment, and then you've got to go and figure out which make and model was actually applied, and you can get all that stuff out manually, but again, it's probably one of those areas where AI could have streamlined that process and made it a fair bit quicker.
2 minutes, anyone?
No, I'll give you 2 minutes back. How's that? So look, thanks for listening. Thanks for coming along. If you can give me some feedback in the app, just go onto the presentation, click on the feedback button for this session, and give some feedback. That'd be helpful. I always look forward to getting that, and I know Mainstream do. But I think we've got 5 minutes or 7 minutes now before the next session. So I'm going to be chairing the room in here. So if you're staying here, you'll see me again. But otherwise, feel free to change rooms. Thanks very much.